I'd say every year doesn't mean you get a better. Yeah, they all run and work for the most part. Now it's horribly noisy. And like, I mean, you could hear it above the underneath it and grease it than it is or installed also for a greaser, and make these things basically last the rest of the life. And this spindle here is probably one of the worst.
This is what the deck sounds like after I replaced the bearings and made these spindles greasable. Do not have a clip of what it sounded like before.
So I'm working on my dad's zero-turn mower today, and it's an Encore Extreme 48-inch deck. And the problem with this thing, it does not have greasable spindles. Now this is a commercial unit, commercial machine, and you would think that they would put greasable spindles in this so you don't have to take it apart to change out the bearings once they wear out, because it's not if they'll wear out, it's when they'll wear out. So I've done this once before on this machine, and I did not put in grease zerks on the spindles. So now's the time we're finally going to do it, and hopefully this will fix this problem, because I'd say every year to every other year, so 1 to 2 years, we have to put in new spindle bearings. And this machine was not cheap whatsoever. It was a very, very expensive piece of equipment. And so the John Deere was probably a little bit less than half the price. And believe it or not, it has greasable spindles on the deck here, where the pulleys are. But this machine that cost at least twice as much doesn't. So I guess what I'm trying to point out here is, just because you spend more money on something doesn't mean you get a better product, a better machine. That's not always true. Wasn't planning on making this video, but I figured why not. So I took the deck apart, and I have one of the spindles here, and I hope you guys can hear that. Now it's not rubbing on anything. You hear how dry the bearings sound? And this is a new bearing to put in these, and this is actually a good bearing here. Of course it's made in China. But what I bought, there's two kinds of bearings that you can buy, maybe even more, just the two that I know of. They have ones with a rubber seal, and then they also have others with a metal seal, like what this one has, and the ones with the metal seals are much, much, much better. So the plan is, pull the spindles apart, put in a new bearing, one on each side, obviously, and then drill and tap a grease zert here, and we'll fill this entire cavity up with grease. Well, at least that's the plan. So, and of course, these ones, you don't even hear them spinning. So it's time for some new bearings in these spindles. And boy, these old spindles, man, did they make things. They made it very, very noisy. The deck was horribly noisy. And like, I mean, you could hear it above the roar of the motor. So, really, it's not good to have them running like that, because obviously, if they're dry, they're also generating more heat. So, but I've taken the spindles all out of the deck, and I'm going to take them apart, and then I will drill and tap the grease zert in, and then after that, we'll fill this entire cavity up with, it's probably going to take tube and a half of grease to do this. But, it's well worth it. It's easier to grease this, get underneath it and grease it, than it is to take this all apart and replace the bearings every year or two. So the last thing before we do this I wanted to mention, so the dealer that we take this zero turn to, he wanted $150 a pop to, I think it was just for the parts. It was either just the parts or installed also. And so that's $450 to replace all the spindles in this, the whole housing and everything. So basically this whole piece here with the bearings in the shaft up top here. I went on eBay and found these bearings here. I bought 10 of them and I only need 6. So I bought 10 of them for, I don't know, about 25 bucks. And the drill bit and the tap came to like $15.09. So 25, 35, 40. For 40 bucks, say like 45. For $45, I can put all new bearings and spindles, or bearings in this, and drill and tap for a grease cert, and make these things basically last the rest of the life of the machine for about, what, less than a third of the price for one whole spindle assembly. And you know, basically, I'm just replacing what needs replaced. This housing's fine, the shaft's fine. All that needs replaced is just the 2 bearings. So, you know, dealers have their place, but man, is it expensive. And this spindle here is probably one of the worst ones. Hear how noisy it is? I mean, it still spins okay, and there's really no play, but everything is just really dry in there. So I'm pretty sure greasing this, putting a grease cert, drilling and tapping a grease cert into the housing here is the best solution, and it should make these spindles last forever, or at least for the life of the machine.
Here I am taking apart the old spindles. There's like a little clip that you have to dig out of the top bearing that keeps everything in place, and that can be a pain sometimes. So already I got the bearing out of the top one. Actually, I'm working on the second one now, but some of these were, water apparently had gotten in between the shaft and the inner race on the bearing and rusted it solid. So here I am trying to heat up the shaft, or sorry, heat up the bearing so it will expand off of the shaft. And it did work. The bottom bearing, it did not work on. I tried digging it out with a screwdriver and penetrating oil and a hammer, and I even used heat to try and expand this bearing off of the shaft, but I could not get it off. So I eventually got out a Dremel, and I just cut the inner and outer race of the bearing. So yeah, there I'm cutting it, and that did eventually work. I mean, the old bearings were junk anyway, so you know, I didn't really feel bad about butchering these things. And I tried my hardest not to cut into the shaft. This was kind of some delicate work here, and it did work. I just stuck a screwdriver in the slot that I had made, gave it a twist, and it broke it free. I really need a shop press to do stuff like this. We seem to be needing a shop press more and more and more. So maybe someday I will invest in one. They're not on super expensive, but it's not something I need a ton. You know, it'll just sit in the corner of the shop and not get used for the most of the time that I have it. And here I am using an XY slide vise to drill these things with the drill press. And here I am tapping the holes. Fortunately, I went into town and got the correct drill bit and the correct tap to do this right. I took in the greaser with me and made sure I got everything correct. I really need a good set of tap and dies and a good drill bit set to match them. But I don't have them. They're kind of expensive. Harbor Freight has some for, I don't know, $100 or it's like $100 to $200 per set, and you need two of them because you have the metric and SAE. And if I'm going to have a set of tap and dies, it's going to be a complete set. But I'm just tapping away here and putting some oil on the tap so I don't heat things up. I didn't actually have the right handle for this tap. The one that I did have was smaller and it wouldn't fit over the end of the tap. So I had to rig up something with using, this would be a thread cutter, and I used that as the square piece that goes over top of the tap so that I could turn the tap without having to use a handle or a some sort of like a crescent wrench, an open end wrench to turn this. And here I am putting everything back together. I took out the inner seals on both bearings so that obviously grease could get in. And I'm using RTV silicone to hopefully seal up the bottom, because I think obviously when the grease gets warm, it will leak out of the bottom of this thing, and I really don't want that to happen. And I'm just filling these cavities with grease now. We have two types of grease guns. We have a continuous flow, and we also have a single shot grease gun, which puts out more pressure than the continuous flow one does. But for this application, I was able to just use the continuous flow one because, you know, it's just pull the trigger and go. I guess that would be Harbor Freight's fully automatic grease gun. And these cavities for these spindles it did definitely take up some grease. I think I did use about a tube and a half of grease just to fill them up. And even still, grease is cheap. You know, if you look at engines, transmissions, differentials, transfer case, gearboxes, they all run in an oil bath, and bearings should run in a grease bath or oil bath of some sort. And I think that's the key to making these things last. But I'm getting everything put back together here, and hopefully I did drill a hole also to let grease go out of the bearing. So, you know, as you're greasing it, obviously the grease has to go somewhere, so you know that it's full. And I chose to do that on the top bearing instead of the bottom bearing. Whenever I took the old spindles apart, the bottom bearing was almost like new, so a lot of the load was on the top bearing, and I wanted the grease to flow out of the top bearing so I know that the top one is greased. You know, it's getting ample grease versus it coming out the bottom one. Well, I'm assuming the top bearing is getting enough of grease, but I don't entirely know that. And I'm also greasing the entire machine here. It really needed greased quite badly, so I am glad I did it.
I've got the mower back together. All the spindles are in, the side covers are on, the blades are tight, the pulley is tight on the top of each of them. I got the belt on, and since I was at it, I greased the whole machine also. So this machine definitely needs a good run too. You know, sitting on these for the winter, you know, when they're not doing anything, it's really tough on them. And I'm really glad I welded some hooks or lifting points on the front of this thing. I actually did that with the 90 amp
flux core wire welder from Harbor Freight, and I never did any videos. Never did a video on it. So I think we will go and mow some grass with this thing. It just amazes me, a machine that is of this caliber and this price tag does not have greasable spindles. It's beyond me why they would ever even think about doing that. And a much cheaper machine, more than half. Yeah, I think more than half the price of that. This machine has greasable spindles, so it's just one of those things that really is a shocker to me. And just because you spend more money on something doesn't mean it's better made than something like this. But granted, I know I'm comparing two different things, but when it comes to the rotaries and the deck, I would much rather have this than what was on here. So, but I took out the inner and seals on each, and hopefully everything holds together. We will see probably in the next 2 years how well this actually holds up. And I know some people are going to be wondering, why, or isn't dirt going to get into that hole and water going to get into that hole that you drilled on the top? That is a possibility. However, once you grease it, theoretically there should be grease that comes out of that hole, so there's no place for dirt to get in because grease is covering it all. So same thing at the bottom end and the top end. So I did put a little bit of RTV silicone in there, and hopefully that will seal up things and it won't all the grease won't leak out the bottom. But I guess without further ado, let's go do some mowing with this thing.
I've noticed it takes more power to get the rotaries up spinning, get the blade spinning after I did this, because it's got to move around all the grease, and of course there wasn't much grease in there before. And of course I've fast forwarded this clip, and the mower seems to mow pretty good. Everything spins nice, it sounds good, like it's getting lots of lubrication, and hopefully this fix will work. Time will tell. So I hope everyone enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'm really glad I did this. Hopefully for the rest of the life that we have this machine, I won't ever have to go in here again and fix these bearings. I'm very, very happy, very pleased with how this turned out. There were a couple other pulleys on this machine one of them had about a 1/4 inch of play on it, and the other ones seemed to be pretty good. So I need to replace those at some point. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say for this video. So thanks for watching. Hope everyone enjoyed it. This is how we turn non-greasable spindles into greasable ones.